Tonight, we journey into the shadows, unraveling stories of terrifying encounters with entities from realms beyond. If you think you're brave enough, join us as we delve into accounts that defy logic and chill the soul. But beware! Each tale serves as a haunting reminder that some doors should remain closed. Title: The Shadow That Follows. The late afternoon sun bathed the dense forest in a golden hue as the family car trundled down the winding gravel road. Emma sat in the passenger seat, her fingers drumming against her knee as unease gnawed at her. The trees on either side of the path loomed tall, their gnarled branches forming a canopy overhead. Beside her, Michael gripped the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. In the back seat, Jamie chattered excitedly, his face pressed against the glass. His excitement was a sharp contrast to Emma's nervous silence. It had been over 20 years since she had last visited her grandparents' cabin. The cabin had been left untouched since their passing, an unspoken agreement within the family to let it rest in its quiet solitude. Yet here they were, breaking the silence. The closer they got, the more vivid Emma's memories became. She could almost hear the creak of the old wooden porch, smell the scent of pine, and feel the warmth of the fire that her grandmother always kept crackling in the hearth. But those memories were tinged with a shadow she couldn't quite place, an intangible unease that had lingered long after childhood. The car finally came to a stop in front of the cabin, the tires crunching on the gravel driveway. The cabin stood just as Emma remembered it, a weathered structure with a sloping roof and a wraparound porch. The sight of it brought a rush of nostalgia and a faint chill that she couldn't shake. "Here we are," Michael said, killing the engine. "Finally!" Jamie burst out of the car, his small figure darting toward the porch. His laughter echoed in the stillness, breaking the eerie quiet of the forest. Emma stepped out of the car slowly, her gaze sweeping over the cabin. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint metallic sound of the old wind chime hanging by the porch. Its haunting melody sent a shiver down her spine. "Come on, Emma," Michael called, hefting their bags out of the trunk. "It's just a cabin." But to Emma, it was more than just a cabin. It was a place steeped in history, both hers and someone else's. The interior of the cabin was as rustic as Emma remembered. The smell of aged wood filled the air, mingling with the faint mustiness of a home long uninhabited. The stone hearth dominated the living room, its surface blackened from countless fires. Emma ran her fingers over the mantel, her touch stirring a small cloud of dust. "Mom, look," Jamie called, holding up a faded photograph he had found on the shelf. It was of her grandparents, smiling warmly. The sight of their faces brought a pang of sadness, but it was quickly overshadowed by the peculiar feeling that someone was watching. Michael began unpacking while Emma busied herself tidying up. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest outside grew darker, the towering trees casting long shadows that crept toward the cabin. Jamie played on the rug with his toy cars, his laughter filling the room. But Emma noticed something peculiar. His laughter would pause abruptly, followed by hushed whispers. "Jamie," she called from the kitchen. "Who are you talking to?" Jamie looked up, his expression innocent. "The man outside." Emma froze, the hairs on her arms standing on end. "What man?" He pointed to the large window that overlooked the forest. "He's standing by the trees." Her heart raced as she approached the window, but when she looked out, all she saw was the dense forest, dark and still. "There's no one there, sweetie," she said, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound calm. Jamie shrugged and returned to his cars as if nothing had happened. That night, Emma lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying Jamie's words. The man outside. She tried to brush it off as a child's overactive imagination, but the sense of unease lingered. It was well past midnight when Emma awoke to the faint sound of tapping. She lay still, her breath shallow, as the sound grew louder. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and unmistakably coming from the window in the living room. Gathering her courage, Emma slipped out of bed and tiptoed down the hall. The cabin was cloaked in darkness, save for the pale moonlight streaming through the windows. The tapping continued, steady and unrelenting. She hesitated at the living room doorway, her heart pounding. Slowly, she peered around the corner and froze. The window was empty. The tapping stopped. Emma's pulse thundered in her ears as she crept closer. She pulled back the curtain, but all she saw was her own pale reflection staring back at her. The forest beyond was a wall of impenetrable black. Convinced it was a branch scraping against the glass, she turned to go back to bed when she noticed something on the windowpane. Leaning closer, she saw faint smudges, as if someone or something had pressed their hands against the glass. Emma backed away, her breath catching in her throat. She returned to bed but slept fitfully, her dreams filled with shadowy figures and the haunting sound of tapping. The next morning, Emma decided not to mention the incident to Michael. She didn't want to alarm him or herself. But as the day went on, Jamie's behavior became increasingly odd. He spent hours staring out the window, his lips moving as if in conversation. When Emma asked him what he was doing, he replied matter-of-factly, "I'm talking to the scary man." Emma's blood ran cold. "Who's the scary man?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Jamie turned to her, his expression serious. "He lives in the woods. He said he doesn't like when people stay here too long." Emma's stomach twisted. "Jamie, there's no one in the woods." "Yes, there is," Jamie insisted. "I saw him last night." The words sent a chill down her spine. Determined to put her fears to rest, Emma decided to search the area around the cabin. She ventured into the woods with a flashlight, the afternoon light casting eerie patterns through the trees. The forest was silent except for the crunch of leaves beneath her boots. About 50 yards from the cabin, she stumbled upon something that made her stop short. It was an old water heater, rusted and covered in deep scratches that resembled a face. The sight of it brought a strange sense of déjà vu. Emma hurried back to the cabin, clutching her discovery like a talisman against the growing unease. But when she asked Jamie about the scary man later that evening, his response was chilling. "He's mad," Jamie said simply. "He doesn't like you being here." The following morning dawned cold and gray, the overcast sky casting a somber pall over the cabin. Emma woke to the sound of Jamie giggling in the living room. She rubbed the sleep from her eyes and found him kneeling by the window, talking in hushed tones. "Who are you talking to, Jamie?" Emma asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and worry. Jamie turned, his face lighting up. "The scary man. He was outside again." Emma's stomach tightened. "What did he say?" "He said he's glad you found his hiding spot yesterday." The words struck her like a physical blow. Jamie couldn't have known about her discovery of the water heater deep in the woods. She hadn't told anyone. Her knees went weak as she steadied herself against the doorframe. "Jamie, it's just an old piece of junk. There's no man." Jamie frowned, as if she didn't understand something obvious. "He said you wouldn't believe me." Emma's hands trembled as she busied herself making breakfast. The mundane task did little to calm her racing thoughts. She decided she needed to dig deeper into the cabin's past, but she would wait until Michael was out of earshot. He had already dismissed her concerns, and she wasn't ready for another argument. Later that afternoon, Emma sent Michael and Jamie to the lake to skip rocks, seizing the quiet time to herself. She rummaged through the attic, hoping to find something that could explain the cabin's strange aura. The attic was a cluttered space, filled with boxes of old photographs, tools, and trinkets. After an hour of searching, Emma uncovered a bundle of yellowed papers tied with twine. The handwriting was her grandfather's, scrawled in shaky letters. It appeared to be a journal, but much of the writing was illegible. One entry caught her attention. "He watches. I feel him more than I see him. Scratched face in the shadows. I tried to fix it, but the marks never fade." Emma's hands shook as she read the words. Her grandfather had noticed the same strange presence. What did he mean by "tried to fix it"? Was he referring to the water heater, or something else entirely? She quickly tucked the journal under her arm as she heard the sound of the car returning. Michael and Jamie would never let her live down her overactive imagination if they saw her like this. That evening, as the family sat around the fire, Emma couldn't shake her unease. Jamie played quietly with his toy cars while Michael poked at the crackling flames. The cabin felt oppressive, as though the walls were closing in. "I found some of Grandpa's old notes," Emma said carefully. "Did you know he kept a journal?" Michael shrugged. "Probably about his gardening or fishing trips." "Why?" Emma hesitated. "He mentioned seeing something out in the woods." Michael chuckled. "Come on, Emma. Are you really buying into Jamie's stories? Don't you think it's strange?" she pressed. "The things Jamie says match what Grandpa wrote about." Michael sighed. "Kids have imaginations. And as for your grandpa, he was getting old. Maybe he was just losing touch." Jamie interrupted them. "The scary man doesn't like when you argue." Both parents turned to look at him. He was staring intently at the fire, as if listening to something they couldn't hear. "Jamie," Michael said firmly, "there's no scary man. It's just a story." Jamie's head snapped toward his father. "He says you're wrong." A chill ran through the room. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, and the wind outside howled against the cabin walls. Unable to sleep, Emma lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Michael snored softly beside her, oblivious to her growing anxiety. She kept replaying Jamie's words in her mind. "He's glad you found his hiding spot." At midnight, a sound jolted her from her thoughts. A faint creaking, as if someone were walking on the porch. Her breath caught in her throat. She sat up, straining to hear. The creaking stopped, replaced by a soft, rhythmic tapping. Emma slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Michael. She crept to the living room and peeked out the window. At first, she saw nothing but the dark outline of the forest. Then her eyes adjusted, and she saw it. A tall figure standing just beyond the tree line. She gasped and stumbled back, knocking over a lamp. Michael rushed in, groggy but alert. "What happened?" "There's someone outside," Emma whispered. Michael grabbed a flashlight and flung open the front door. He shined the beam into the woods, revealing only trees and underbrush. "There's no one here, Emma." "I saw him," she insisted, her voice shaking. "Right there." Michael sighed. "It's late. Let's get some sleep." But Emma couldn't sleep. She spent the rest of the night sitting by the window, watching the woods for any sign of movement. The next morning, Emma decided to take Jamie into town. She needed a break from the cabin's oppressive atmosphere. As they walked through the local market, an older man approached them. His face was weathered, and his eyes were sharp with curiosity. "You're staying at the old cabin, aren't you?" he asked. Emma nodded cautiously. "How did you know?" "It's a small town," he said. "Word gets around. That place has a history." Emma's heart sank. "What kind of history?" The man glanced at Jamie, then lowered his voice. "Strange things have happened there. The family who lived there before your grandparents left in a hurry. Some say they saw things." Emma pressed him for more details, but the man waved her off. "Best not to dig too deep. Some places are better left alone." That evening, Emma decided to confront the journal again. She read through it more carefully, piecing together fragments of her grandfather's observations. One entry stood out. "The face on the tank. It's not just scratches. It's him. He doesn't leave. He waits." Emma felt the blood drain from her face. Her grandfather had tried to warn them, but the meaning had been lost over the years. She thought of Jamie's drawings. Distorted figures with long arms and hollow eyes. The cabin creaked as the wind picked up outside. Emma felt the weight of something unspoken pressing down on her. The scary man wasn't just a figment of Jamie's imagination. He was something or someone her family had been living with all along. That night, Emma woke to Jamie's scream. She bolted out of bed and found him standing in the living room, pointing at the window. The glass was fogged up, and in the condensation, a crude face had been drawn with long, jagged lines. Michael rushed in, demanding to know what was going on. Emma pointed to the window, but when they looked again, the face was gone. "Emma," Michael said, his voice trembling. "What's happening here?" "I don't know," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. But we need to leave. Michael didn't argue. They packed their things in silence, the oppressive weight of the cabin pressing on them as they prepared to leave. Emma sat in the passenger seat, gripping the door handle as the family car bumped along the dirt road leading away from the cabin. Jamie sat quietly in the back, his usual chatter replaced with an eerie silence. Michael kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The oppressive silence inside the car was suffocating. Emma glanced back at Jamie, whose eyes seemed fixed on something unseen. "Jamie?" she said softly. "Are you okay?" Jamie didn't look at her. Instead, he whispered, "He's following us." Emma's stomach churned. She turned to Michael, who shook his head as if to dismiss the comment, but the tension in his jaw betrayed his unease. "We'll be home soon," Michael muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Back home, the family tried to resume their normal routine. Michael buried himself in work, while Emma attempted to distract herself with Jamie's schooling and chores. But Jamie wasn't the same. He was quieter, more withdrawn. At night, Emma would find him staring out his bedroom window, his little hands pressed against the glass. "Jamie, what are you looking at?" she asked one evening. "The woods," he replied simply. Emma's heart sank. Their suburban neighborhood was far from the cabin, but a small wooded area bordered their backyard. "There's nothing out there, sweetheart," she said, kneeling beside him. Jamie turned to her, his eyes wide and solemn. "He doesn't like when you lie." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She pulled the curtains shut and tucked Jamie into bed, but sleep eluded her that night. Haunted by Jamie's words, Emma dove into research about the cabin and the land it sat on. She visited the local library and sifted through old records, determined to find answers. What she uncovered was unsettling. The cabin's original owner, a man named Elias Granger, had lived there alone in the 1940s. Locals had described him as a paranoid recluse who believed he was being watched. He had carved symbols into the walls of his home, claiming they would protect him from the shadow in the woods. Emma's hands shook as she read a faded newspaper article from 1947. "Local man found dead in mysterious circumstances." The article detailed how Elias had been discovered in his cabin, his body contorted and his face frozen in terror. Authorities had ruled it a heart attack, but rumors persisted that something unnatural had caused his death. The final line of the article sent a chill down her spine. Survivors have reported seeing strange figures near the property, even decades after Granger's death. Back at home, Emma shared her findings with Michael. He listened with a skeptical frown, but she could see the cracks forming in his stoic facade. "This is just old folklore," he said. "People love a good ghost story." "Then explain, Jamie," Emma shot back. "Explain the markings in the cabin, the things we've all seen." Michael rubbed his temples. "Look, even if there's some history to the place, we're not there anymore. It's over." Emma wasn't convinced, but she let the conversation drop. That night, she woke to the sound of Jamie crying. Rushing to his room, she found him huddled under his blankets, his small frame trembling. "He's here," Jamie whispered. "He's in the yard." Emma pulled back the curtain and froze. There, at the edge of the woods, stood a tall figure. His outline was barely visible in the moonlight, but there was no mistaking the hollow darkness where his face should have been. The next morning, Emma convinced Michael to let her install security cameras around the house. "If nothing else," she argued, "it'll prove whether or not we're imagining things." Michael reluctantly agreed, and by nightfall the cameras were set up. Emma watched the live feed obsessively, her nerves frayed. The hours dragged on, and the screens showed nothing but empty yards and swaying trees. Just as she was about to turn in for the night, the motion detector beeped. Emma's heart pounded as she clicked on the alert. On the screen, the figure stood at the edge of the woods, staring directly into the camera. She woke Michael, who groaned in frustration but followed her to the monitor. When he saw the footage, his face drained of color. "Call the police," he said. The police arrived within minutes, but by then, the figure was gone. They searched the property and found no signs of an intruder. Emma showed them the footage, but the officer shrugged. "Could be a prank," he said. Kids messing around. Michael seemed eager to accept the explanation, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was at play. That night, the family slept in the same room, the doors locked and the curtains drawn. But the sense of safety was an illusion. Emma woke to the sound of footsteps in the hall. She nudged Michael awake, and together they crept to the door. The footsteps stopped outside Jamie's room. Emma's heart thundered as she flung the door open. Jamie was sitting up in bed, staring at the window. "He says it's time to go," Jamie said. Panicking, Emma and Michael grabbed Jamie and fled the house. They drove for hours, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the woods. Emma didn't know where they were going. She only knew they couldn't stay. As dawn broke, they found themselves in a quiet motel off the highway. Michael collapsed onto the bed, exhausted, while Emma sat by the window, keeping watch. Jamie slept fitfully, murmuring under his breath. When Michael finally woke, he turned to Emma with a grim expression. "We can't keep running. We need help." Emma nodded. They decided to seek out a specialist in local folklore, someone who might have answers. The historian they consulted listened carefully to their story. "What you're describing," he said, "sounds like an old legend. The scary man is thought to be a manifestation of guilt or fear tied to the land." "Can we stop it?" Emma asked. The historian shook his head. "If it's tied to the land, leaving should have broken the connection. But if it's followed you—" He trailed off, his expression grim. Determined to end the nightmare, Emma convinced Michael to return to the cabin one last time. Armed with the historian's advice, they planned to destroy the water heater and the symbols carved into the cabin. As they tore down the old structure, Emma found something buried beneath the floorboards. A rusted locket containing a photo of Elias Granger. On the back were etched the words, "Forgive me." With the cabin reduced to rubble, the family left for good. The sense of dread slowly lifted, and Jamie stopped mentioning the scary man. But late at night, Emma would sometimes wake with the feeling of being watched. And in the shadows outside her window, she thought she saw a familiar figure.